Hey everybody, it's Jason Blaha here, and today I would like to discuss with you guys a little bit about muscle and body fat versus cancer and diabetes. So if you guys will please click like down below, I'd greatly appreciate it. If you are not following or subscribe, please do so. And if you would be kind enough to drop me a comment down below, I would appreciate that so much. Thank you. So let's get over into the topic. Again, this has been well-studied. Mechanisms are understood. We know a lot about what's going on here. So what people have to understand when it comes to things like glucose disposal, insulin sensitivity, inflammation in the body, all these things we do have to understand. Muscle tissue and fat tissue are not just things that sit there. They're very metabolically active tissue. They affect a lot of things in the body directly. And people seem to be legitimately oftentimes unaware of this. So, I mean, a perfect example. So if we're going to talk about inflammation in the body, which again, that's going to affect things like cancer, it's going to affect cardiovascular disease, all this stuff, right? Body fat neutral, like people have this idea, they're like, for example, one of the things I see all the time, people will say things like, oh, well, it's all this insulin resistance and it's this inflammation that's causing body fat gain. No, the body fat is what's causing it. So in other words, a lot of times people are correlating these things, and you'll see gurus try to push this, but the reality is overeating causes you to gain body fat, okay? Excess calories, excess dietary fat, all of that mixed together, because we only really store the fat as body fat. Now, when someone says, so I could eat a diet that's semi-low in fat, well, no, you'll just gain small amounts of fat forever. You'll gain fat. So it's not what I'm saying. It is still going to be the energy surplus that is created. Net total energy surplus is going through to cause accumulation of body fat on a weekly basis, one way or another. But ultimately, yes, it is the fat you eat that stores. Now, that being said, it's still surplus energy. That is what causes you to gain fat. None of this other stuff directly causes fat storage. Cortisol, insulin resistance, none of this does not cause fat gain. But let's get over and talk about the fat and then think about how this affects these other diseases. Body fat scales proportionately to the hormones it produces. In other words, if you're thinking in terms of the inflammatory markers that body fat produces, because keep in mind, body fat is inflammatory. So we need to be clear on that. Someone starts talking about inflammation in the body, your body fat is one of the biggest, absolutely biggest factors, right? This is up near pretty much at the top of the list, even more so than your diet. We could argue, yeah, in extreme cases, more than your diet. So a morbidly obese person, their body fat alone produces more inflammation than their diet is even capable of doing. Okay, so even if they were to switch over to a very clean diet, the body fat alone is going to push the inflammatory markers way up. Now, when they go into a calorie deficit, they may go down for a little while during it, but once it restabilizes, and it's going to go back up. So what we're looking at here is body fat itself creates inflammation. Large amounts of it on its own, and it scales. In other words, if you have 100 pounds of fat versus 50, you're going to see a much larger push, right? Because it scales. It's metabolically active tissue, right? This also contributes to insulin resistance. Well, big factor in cancer, insulin resistance. Biggest factor in diabetes, insulin resistance. Okay, type 2 diabetes. This is insulin resistance. Well, body fat creates insulin resistance, particularly when you start storing it around organs viscerally in your liver, right? Which will happen. And that proportion of visceral fat versus subcutaneous fat is diet dependent. But the weight gain itself is purely the energy and fat surplus. That's where it all comes from. But as far as how much of it coming to the organs, that's going to be metabolically impacted by the quality of your diet. But yeah, that creates insulin resistance. Well, insulin resistance causes cancer. Insulin resistance causes diabetes. These are enormous contributors. Well, it's everything on diabetes. It's almost everything, by far the biggest factor. But cancer, insulin resistance. Why? You have higher fasting insulin. You have higher glucose levels when you're insulin resistant, even on a low carb diet. People are extremely athletic, lean people with amazing insulin sensitivity have lower resting glucose and lower glucose levels than people on keto diets who are not in shape. So there's your context. Understand this. All right. Elevated insulin and glucose all the time absolutely contribute to cancer. It's what feeds tumors. Tumors are extremely insulin sensitive. They will suck it up real quick. So, but what else is the next most insulin sensitive tissue you can think of in the body is going to be what? What's the number one? Muscle tissue. All right, particularly trained muscle tissue. Man, you've worked out in the last day. Okay? Your muscle tissue is an enormous insulin sponge, and it scales with size. In other words, if you have 50 pounds of muscle versus 100 pounds of muscle on your body, it's going to suck up twice as much insulin and glucose just resting, just laying around. So think in terms of insulin sensitivity, insulin response. When you are insulin sensitive like that, your body produces less insulin for every unit of glucose floating around. Okay? So in other words, muscle tissue is competing for it, making your body produce less because it needs less of it, right? So when you're thinking things like tumors, what happens? Muscle tissue competes with it. And this is why we have plenty of data showing that lifting weights is largely protective against cancer, and it dramatically increases your odds of surviving cancer treatment. That was a big one. Why? Because once you have the cancer and your body's fighting it, your muscle tissue literally competes with it for resources. Well, it helps starve it. If your tumors are getting less fuel and less energy to grow, they're easier for the treatment to fight them, or even easier for your body to fight them. Muscle tissue is protective. Come over to diabetes, just like we talked about with the body fat. Well, athletic, lean people don't get type 2 diabetes unless they take drugs that cause it. Poor people say, I don't understand. Well, because you don't know that. If you don't understand that we don't need to go through it, I'm not going to go down the list of drugs that bodybuilders in the extreme end use that can contribute to diabetes. But it's drugs. Drugs are contributing. Okay? So when you do see a fit athlete or bodybuilder, like really serious, who does get type 2 diabetes, that's drug induced. That's a drug side effect they've subjected their body to from using large, insane amounts of certain things. But otherwise, muscle mass, you just don't see it. It doesn't happen. It doesn't happen. All right, guys, but that's really all I have to say on that today. I hope it's been informative, and I'll talk to you guys and gals next time.